blood mixed with mud on the courtyard stones. That's what Alice remembered most. Not the jeers, not the cold wind biting through her thin linen shift. Just the sharp metallic tang of her own ruin orchestrated by the man she'd loved for 6 years. Gareth didn't just break her heart. He tore her hard-won rank from her neck in front of 300 wolves. He thought he had buried her. He didn't know the Alpha King was watching from the shadows. The great hall of Oakhaven smelled of roasted marrow, wet wool, and impending betrayal. Alice stood in the drafty antechamber, the chill of the rough-hewn stone seeping through the soles of her leather boots. She twisted the heavy bronze ring on her right index finger, the sigil of the lead huntress. It was a heavy, ugly thing forged in a time when the pack cared more about survival than aesthetics. Alice had earned it with 3 cracked ribs and a tear in her thigh that still ached when the winter snows set in. Tonight was supposed to be her night, the winter solstice. The night Gareth, the newly ascended Alpha of Oakhaven, was expected to formally take his mate and elevate her to Luna. They had been together since they were pups tumbling in the dirt, since the days before the weight of leadership had hardened his jaw and clouded his eyes. 6 years of shared kills, shared beds, and shared blood. "You look tense," a voice murmured from the shadows. Alice glanced over her shoulder. It was Bran, her second-in-command on the hunting patrols. His face was a map of pale scars, half hidden by a thick, unkempt beard. "I'm not tense." Alice lied, her voice a low rasp. "I'm cold. The drafts in this keep are older than the gods." Bran didn't smile. His eyes darted toward the heavy oak doors that separated them from the roar of the pack inside. "Something feels off, Alice. The air in there. It's thick. Gareth has his inner circle guarding the dais, not the usual men. He's brought in mercenaries from the lowlands." A prickle of unease washed over her skin. Her wolf, usually a quiet, steady presence in the back of her mind, paced restlessly. "Danger," it whispered. Strangers. Scent of copper and rot. "Gareth is just paranoid," Alice said, though the words tasted like ash. "His father's death is still fresh. He wants a show of strength." "A show of strength is one thing," Bran muttered, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "But he's been spending a lot of time with Lord Alden's envoy, and Alden's daughter Sibylla arrived yesterday with a wagon train of dowry silk." Alice's stomach plummeted. Sibylla, a delicate, soft-handed girl from a wealthy southern pack who smelled of crushed roses and lived a life entirely devoid of violence. She was a political prize, a key to trade routes and grain shipments that Oakhaven desperately needed after 3 brutal winters. "I am his mate, Bran. Unmarked but chosen. We bled together on the hunting grounds." "Wolves bleed," Bran said softly. "Politicians trade." Before Alice could reply, the heavy iron-wrought doors groaned open. The sudden blast of heat noise and the heavy musk of 300 gathered werewolves hit her like a physical blow. The ceremonial horn sounded a low, mournful bellow that vibrated in her chest. It was time. Alice squared her shoulders. She wore her ceremonial garb, a tunic of deep forest green leather breeches, and the heavy grey wolf-pelt mantle draped over her shoulders, pinned at the collarbone with the bronze huntress sigil. She had brushed her dark hair until it shone, braiding it tight against her scalp in the warrior's fashion. She looked like the North. She looked like survival. She stepped into the light. The hall grew quiet as she walked down the center aisle. Hundreds of eyes tracked her. Some held respect. Others, she noticed with a sickening jolt, held pity. Pity was a dangerous scent in a werewolf pack. It smelled like sour milk and rotting leaves. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a dais of black stone, sat Gareth. He was striking in the firelight. Broad-shouldered with hair the color of wheat, and eyes like chipped ice. He wore the heavy fur cloak of the Alpha, the mantle his father had died in only months prior. But as Alice approached, she didn't see the boy who used to weave wild flowers into her hair. She saw a stranger. His jaw was locked tight. His eyes were flat, calculating, and entirely devoid of warmth. And there, standing 2 paces to his right, was Sibylla. She wore a gown of crimson velvet that swept the stone floor, her golden hair cascading down her back in soft, perfectly arranged curls. She looked completely out of place in the brutal, smoke-stained hall of Oakhaven. But Gareth's hand rested casually on the back of Sibylla's chair. Alice stopped at the base of the dais. Silence stretched over the hall, tight and humming like a bowstring drawn past its limit. "Gareth." Alice said, her voice clear and level, carrying easily to the rafters. She did not kneel. A lead huntress bowed to no one but the gods and the Alpha King himself. "I answer the call of the solstice." Gareth looked down at her. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes, guilt perhaps, or regret. But he blinked, and it was gone, replaced by a cold, impenetrable ambition. He stood. The hall held its breath. "Alice of the Northern Ridge." Gareth's voice boomed loud and unfamiliar. It was the voice of an alpha performing for a crowd. "You have served this pack well in the dirt and the blood. You have guarded our borders." Served. The word struck her like an open-handed slap. Not loved, not led, served, but Oakhaven is changing. Gareth continued, stepping down the first stone stair. "The winters grow longer. The prey grows scarce. We can no longer survive on the strength of our claws alone. We need alliances. We need coin. We need a future that doesn't end in freezing to death in the dark." Alice felt the blood drain from her face. Her wolf snarled, throwing itself against the cage of her ribs, demanding she shift, demanding she tear his throat out. She forced it down, locking her knees to keep from trembling. "You speak of survival?" Alice said, her voice dropping an octave, dangerously calm. "I am the one who brings the meat to your tables. I am the one who bled to keep the rogues from your borders while you sat in council. And you are commended for it." Gareth snapped his temper, flaring at her defiance. He didn't want a conversation. He wanted an execution. But a lead huntress is a soldier. A pack requires a Luna who can navigate the courts of the South. A Luna who brings resources, not just carcasses. A low murmur rippled through the hall. Some nodded. The hungry ones, the cold ones. Gareth took another step down. He was standing directly in front of her now. He smelled of pine sweat and the cloying, sweet scent of Sibylla's rose perfume. "Your time as the head of the vanguard is over, Alice. You are too rigid, too tied to the old ways. I am restructuring the guard. Bran will take over the hunts. You are hereby stripped of your rank." The words hung in the air, suspended in the thick smoke of the hearth fires. Stripped of your rank. It wasn't just a demotion. It was an unmaking. To a werewolf, rank was identity. It was where you ate, where you slept, how you breathed. To strip a high-ranking wolf in public was to declare them broken, useless. It was a humiliation meant to drive them into exile. Alice stared at him, her chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a tear. She refused to let her voice shake. "You do this not for the pack." Alice said, her tone conversational, though it echoed in the dead silence of the room. "You do this for a dowry." "Watch your tone," Gareth hissed, leaning in close. His eyes flashed gold, his wolf pushing forward to demand submission. "I am your alpha." "You are a coward," she whispered back. Gareth's face contorted in rage. He reached out and grabbed the front of her mantle. He didn't unhook the clasp gently. He yanked. The heavy bronze pin secured tightly to the thick leather and linen of her tunic caught. Gareth ripped it downward with brute force. The pin tore through the fabric, slicing a jagged line across Alice's collarbone. A sharp gasp echoed from the crowd as blood welled up bright and stark against her pale skin. The heavy grey wolf pelt slipped from her shoulders and hit the floor with a dull, heavy thud. The bronze sigil clattered against the stone. The cold air of the hall bit into her suddenly bare arms. Underneath the mantle she wore only a thin, sleeveless undertunic. She was exposed, stripped, bleeding. Gareth kicked the pelt aside. He turned his back on her a final definitive dismissal and walked back up the stairs. He extended a hand to Sibylla. The southern girl stood looking down at Alice with a mixture of triumph and feigned pity. "Sibylla of House Alden is your new Luna," Gareth declared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "And she brings with her the southern trade routes. Tonight we feast to a new era." A scattered cheer went up from Gareth's newly hired guards, followed slowly, hesitantly, by the rest of the pack. They were looking away from Alice now. The severing was complete. She was a ghost in her own home. If she stayed, she would be an Omega forced to scrub floors and eat scraps. If she left, she was a rogue fair game for any hunter. Alice stood perfectly still. The blood from her collarbone dripped in a slow, agonizing tick down her chest, staining the green linen of her tunic black. "Walk out," her mind screamed. "Shift and run. Let the winter take you." But her feet were lead. The shock of the betrayal was a physical weight crushing the air from her lungs. 6 years. 6 years of fighting back to back in the mud. She had killed for him. She had starved so he could eat during the famine. And he had traded her for silk and grain without a second thought. She looked at the faces in the crowd. Bran was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched, but he didn't step forward. The women she had trained looked away ashamed. Survival instinct was stronger than loyalty. Gareth held the power. Gareth held the food. "Leave the hall, Alice," Gareth commanded, not even bothering to look at her. He was already pouring a cup of wine for Sibylla. "Your presence is souring the celebration. Report to the kitchens in the morning." The kitchens. A deep, visceral growl began in the back of Alice's throat. It wasn't loud, but it was pure, unadulterated violence. It was the sound of a cornered predator, her fingernails elongated, digging into the calloused flesh of her palms. She would not go to the kitchens. She would tear his throat out right here on the steps of his stolen throne and let them kill her for it. She took a step forward, her muscles coiling like a spring. But before she could launch herself at the dais, the air in the great hall changed. It wasn't a sound. It was a sensation, like the sudden drop in barometric pressure right before a massive, world-ending thunderstorm. The hearth fires roaring and crackling a moment before suddenly dimmed, the flames shrinking back as if suffocated by an invisible weight. The casual chatter and forced cheering died in the throats of the wolves. Every single lichen in the room felt it simultaneously. The hackles on the back of Alice's neck rose. Her wolf, seconds away from a suicidal frenzy, instantly dropped to its belly in her mind, whining in absolute instinctual terror. Alpha. Not a pack alpha. Not a regional lord. An alpha of alphas. The massive iron-banded doors at the rear of the hall didn't just open. They were shoved inward with such terrifying force that one of the iron hinges snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The wind howled through the breach carrying snow and the sharp freezing scent of ozone-dark forests and ancient blood. The crowd parted. They didn't just move. They scrambled, stumbling over each other to clear a wide path down the center aisle. Men and women who had been sneering at Alice moments ago were now dropping to their knees, exposing their necks, their bodies trembling violently under the oppressive, suffocating aura rolling off the man standing in the doorway. Alice couldn't breathe. The power in the room was so dense it felt like being buried under 10 feet of ocean water. He walked out of the storm and into the dim light of the hall. Conrad, the Alpha King, the sovereign of the Northern Territories, the executioner of the rogue armies, a man who had not been seen in the lower provinces for nearly a decade. He was a giant of a man, built like a fortress of muscle and bone. He wore no crown, no gold, no silk. He was clad in hardened black leather and armor forged from dark steel, scarred from countless battles. Over his broad shoulders hung the pelt of a massive dire bear, black as a starless night. His hair was dark, cropped short, and his face was carved from granite, harsh, unyielding lines, marred by a pale, jagged scar that ran from his left temple down into his beard. But it was his eyes that stopped the heart. They were a piercing, luminous silver, the eyes of an apex predator. He walked down the center aisle. He made no sound. Despite his massive size and heavy boots, his steps were entirely silent. The only sound in the great hall was the howling of the wind outside and the panicked, shallow breathing of 300 kneeling wolves. Gareth had gone completely white. The goblet of wine slipped from his hand, shattering on the stone dais, the red liquid pooling like blood. He stumbled forward, practically shoving Sibylla out of the way, and dropped to one knee, bowing his head so low it nearly touched the floor. "My king!" Gareth stammered, his polished political voice completely vanishing, replaced by the panicked squeak of a frightened boy. We did not expect you. You honor Oakhaven. We are preparing a feast." Conrad did not look at Gareth. He didn't even acknowledge the Alpha's existence. His silver eyes were locked entirely on Alice. Alice stood alone in the center of the room. She was the only one not kneeling. Her legs refused to buckle, held up by sheer stubborn pride and the paralyzing shock of his presence. She was shivering violently, her skin pale, the blood from her collarbone still dripping down her chest. Conrad stopped 3 feet in front of her. Up close, the sheer scale of the man was overwhelming. He towered over her, a dark monolith. The scent of him wood smoke, cold iron, and dark, damp earth wrapped around her, entirely drowning out the stench of Gareth and Sibylla. He looked down at her. His gaze tracked the jagged, bleeding tear across her collarbone. He looked at the torn fabric of her tunic. He looked at the grey wolf pelt lying discarded in the dirt near Gareth's feet. For a terrible, agonizing moment, he did nothing. He just watched her. Alice stared back, her jaw locked, refusing to drop her eyes even as every instinct screamed at her to submit. Conrad's jaw ticked. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and unclasped the heavy iron chain at his own throat. He pulled the massive black dire-bear mantle from his shoulders. The fur was thick, radiating a deep, intoxicating heat. With a movement entirely too gentle for a man of his size, Conrad stepped into her space and draped his own mantle around Alice's shivering shoulders. The heavy weight of it settled over her. It was heavy enough to crush, yet it felt like a fortress. The king's scent enveloped her completely, a territorial, absolute claim that short-circuited her brain. Conrad reached out his large, calloused fingers, brushing against the unmarred skin of her neck, as he fastened the heavy iron clasp beneath her throat. His touch was a jolt of pure electricity burning away the cold. "You bleed, little wolf," Conrad said. His voice was a deep, resonating rumble that vibrated in the soles of her feet. It wasn't loud, but it commanded the absolute silence of the room. "I heal fast!" Alice rasped out her voice barely above a whisper. The corner of Conrad's mouth twitched a ghost of a smile that never reached his eyes. "I know." Conrad finally turned his head, his silver eyes locking onto Gareth, who was still kneeling, trembling violently on the dais. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "I was passing through your territory, Gareth." Conrad said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "I thought to witness the strength of Oakhaven, to see the legendary lead huntress who kept the eastern ridge clear of rot." Conrad looked at the bronze sigil lying in the dirt. He raised a heavy boot and crushed it flat against the stone. "Instead," the king continued, his voice dropping to a lethal, deadly whisper, "I find a boy playing dress-up, stripping his best warrior bare in the freezing cold for the amusement of a soft southern court." Gareth swallowed hard, panic sweating through his fine clothes. "My king, you don't understand. She defied the council. She is unfit for the new era." "Unfit," Conrad repeated. He turned back to Alice. He looked at her proud, unyielding posture, the fire of defiance still burning in her dark eyes, despite the humiliation. Without another word, Conrad stepped close, wrapping a massive arm around Alice's waist. Before she could protest, before she could even process the movement, he swept her off her feet, lifting her against his chest as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. "She is unfit for you, boy," Conrad said to Gareth, turning toward the open doors. "Because she is mine." He carried her out into the storm, leaving the Alpha of Oakhaven kneeling in the ruins of his own pride. The storm hit them the moment they cleared the keep's heavy gates. Alice didn't fight the king. There was no point. The sheer physical density of the man carrying her made struggling feel like throwing punches at a glacier. She lay rigid against his chest, her face half buried in the rough, dark leather of his armor. The heat radiating off him was immense, a jarring contrast to the bitter wind howling through the courtyard. They left the perimeter of Oakhaven and plunged into the tree line. The noise of the keep, the faint, panicked shouting of Gareth's guards vanished, swallowed instantly by the dense pines and the snow. "Put me down." Alice's voice was muffled by the wind, but she knew he heard it. The acute hearing of an alpha picked up the shift in her breathing before she even spoke. Conrad didn't stop. He didn't even slow his massive, ground-eating strides. "You are barefoot, bleeding, and in shock. You will freeze before we reach the camp. I am a lead huntress. I have survived worse in these woods. Put me down." Conrad stopped. He didn't lower her gently. He released his grip, dropping her the last 2 feet into the snow. Alice hit the ground hard. The shock sent a spike of white-hot pain through her torn collarbone. Her bare feet sank into a snowdrift, the icy wetness biting into her skin. She stumbled her knees, threatening to buckle under the sudden rush of adrenaline and the phantom weight of her severed pack bond, but she forced her legs to lock. She stood upright, pulling the heavy dire-bear mantle tighter around her shoulders. She looked up at him. Conrad stood motionless in the snow, a shadow against the pale winter night. His silver eyes watched her, unblinking, assessing. "I am not a sack of grain to be carried off," Alice said, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "And I am not a prize you won to spite a boy." "I don't play games with boys," Conrad replied. His voice was a low, steady rumble that cut easily through the howling wind. "And I don't collect prizes. I collect soldiers. You said I was yours." The words tasted metallic in her mouth. She hated how her voice shook just a fraction on the last word. Conrad took a step closer. The wind whipped his dark hair around his scarred face. "I claimed you because it was the only way to sever his legal hold on you without slaughtering half the wolves in that hall. Gareth is an idiot, but he is a recognized alpha. By the old laws, to challenge his judgment is an act of war. To claim a mate overrides regional law." Alice stared at him. Her mind, sluggish from the cold and the trauma of the last hour, struggled to process the information. "You lied." "I laid a legal fiction over a tactical extraction?" Conrad corrected flatly. "You were going to kill him." Alice stiffened. "I was going to try." "You would have succeeded," Conrad said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an objective statement of fact. "You would have torn his throat out on the dais, and then his southern mercenaries would have butchered you. You would be a dead hero on a dirty floor, and Oakhaven would still fall to rot. A waste of a perfectly good vanguard commander." He turned and began walking deeper into the woods. "Keep up, Alice. My camp is a mile north." Alice stood in the snow for a long moment. Her feet were going numb. The wound on her chest throbbed in time with her heartbeat. She looked back over her shoulder toward the faint orange glow of Oakhaven through the trees. 6 years. It was gone. All of it. She turned her back to the light and followed the king into the dark. Conrad's encampment was not a royal court. It was a war machine. There were no colorful pavilions, no banners snapping in the wind, no women in velvet dresses pouring wine. There were only low-profile tents made of heavy oiled canvas, pitched in the natural hollows of the landscape to avoid the wind. The fires were built in deep pits, the light hidden, the smoke filtered through layers of pine branches. The wolves here moved with terrifying efficiency. As Conrad strode into the camp, No one knelt. A few gave a brief, sharp salute, striking a fist over their hearts before returning to sharpening blades, packing gear, or tending to the massive destrier horses tethered to the picket lines. "Rourke," Conrad barked. A tall man with a shaved head and a face heavily tattooed with tribal ink stepped out from the shadows of a supply wagon. He looked at Conrad, then shifted his gaze to Alice. His eyes widened fractionally at the sight of the king's heavy mantle wrapped around a bleeding barefoot woman. "My king." Rourke's voice was like grinding stones. "We march at first light." Conrad ordered. "Get her a medic. Bring her a pair of boots that fit. And a horse." "I don't need a horse." Alice interrupted, her teeth chattering despite her best efforts to control it. "I can run with the pack." Rourke raised an eyebrow, looking from Alice to Conrad. "Give her a horse." Conrad repeated, ignoring her entirely. "Her pack bond is severed. The fatigue will hit her in 3 hours." Before Alice could argue, Conrad walked away, disappearing into the largest of the canvas tents without looking back. The next morning, the reality of Conrad's words hit her like a physical blow. Waking up without a pack bond is like waking up underwater. The pack is a sixth sense, a constant low-level hum of shared emotion, territory lines, and belonging. Now there was only silence, a deafening, vast emptiness in her head. Her limbs felt like they were filled with lead. Every muscle ached. She crawled out of the small tent Rourke had provided, laced up the unfamiliar stiff leather boots, and stepped into the freezing dawn. The camp was already packed. The fires were buried. The men were mounted. Rourke tossed her a set of reins. Attached to them was a massive scarred roan gelding that looked as ill-tempered as its owner. "His name is Brick," Rourke said, adjusting the girth on his own saddle. "Don't look him in the eye for too long. He bites." "Good. So do I," Alice muttered, pulling herself up into the saddle. Her collarbone, stitched tightly by the camp medic the night before, screamed in protest. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from making a sound. Conrad rode at the front of the column on a black beast of a horse. He didn't check to see if she was ready. He merely raised a hand and the vanguard moved out. They rode hard for 3 days. They bypassed the main roads, taking sheer mountain passes and frozen riverbeds. It was brutal, punishing work. Alice didn't complain. She ate the hardtack and dried venison they handed out. She slept on the frozen ground. She kept her mouth shut. On the 3rd night, they made camp in a narrow gorge flanked by towering cliffs of black slate. Alice sat near the edge of the perimeter, running a whetstone over her hunting knives. The rhythmic metallic shk-shk sound was the only thing keeping her mind off the agonizing emptiness in her chest. Footsteps crunched in the snow. Conrad stopped a few feet away. He wasn't wearing his armor tonight, just a heavy wool tunic and leather bracers. Without the dark steel, he looked slightly more human, though no less imposing. He held a small leather flask in his hand. "You haven't spoken in 3 days," Conrad said, sitting on a downed log across the small fire pit from her. "I don't have anything to say," Alice replied, not looking up from her blade. "Grief makes a quiet bedfellow. I am not grieving him." Alice snapped the whetstone, pausing against the steel. The lie felt heavy, but she clung to it. "I am angry. There is a difference." "You are grieving the 6 years you wasted," Conrad said, his voice entirely devoid of pity. It was clinical. "You are grieving the pack you bled for. The man is irrelevant. The loss of purpose is what's hollowing you out." Alice finally looked up. His silver eyes reflected the low embers of the fire. He saw too much. It infuriated her. "And what is your purpose, King?" she asked, her tone razor-sharp. "Marching through the snow with an army of ghosts, collecting broken toys from the packs you visit?" Conrad didn't flinch. He unscrewed the cap of the flask and tossed it to her. Alice caught it out of the air. It was warm. "Drink," he ordered. Alice eyed it suspiciously, but her body was shivering violently. The lack of a pack bond was compromising her internal temperature regulation. She uncorked it and took a swallow. It wasn't wine. It was rich, hot, heavily spiced broth, thick with marrow and something metallic. Blood. Alpha blood. The moment the liquid hit her stomach, a violent shudder ran through her entire body. The agonizing hollow ache in her chest instantly dulled. Heat rushed back into her extremities. The paralyzing fatigue lifted. She gasped, dropping the flask to her lap. A packless wolf cannot survive this far north without an anchor. Conrad said quietly, "My blood will stabilize your core. It isn't a bond. It's medicine." Alice wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, staring at him. He was a tyrant, a warlord, a man who crushed rebellions. Yet he sat here in the snow, quietly offering his own blood to keep a disgraced huntress from freezing from the inside out. "Why me?" Alice asked, the fight draining out of her. "There are 100 warriors in Oakhaven." "Because a warrior fights when told—" Conrad answered, holding her gaze. "A lead huntress fights when it's necessary. I saw the way you looked at Gareth before I entered the hall. You weren't broken by the humiliation. You were calculating the exact angle needed to crush his windpipe." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The South is mobilizing. Alden isn't just marrying his daughter to Gareth for trade. He's building a coalition. He wants the northern passes. I don't need a Luna to kiss babies. I need a general who knows the northern ridges better than she knows her own heartbeat." Conrad stood up, the sheer size of him, blocking out the stars above the gorge. "Sleep, Alice. Tomorrow we cross into the Deadlands." The attack came an hour before dawn. Alice was already awake. The king's blood in her system had sharpened her senses to an agonizing degree. She smelled them before the perimeter guard sounded the alarm. It wasn't the scent of rogues. Rogues smelled of starvation, wet rot, and desperation. This scent was organized. Leather polish, horse sweat, steel. And underneath it all the faint, sickly sweet odor of southern rose water. Mercenaries. Alden's men. They had tracked the king's vanguard. It was a suicide mission, highly irregular, meant either to reclaim the stolen bride of Oakhaven to save face, or to test the king's defenses. Alice didn't wait for orders. She kicked her blankets aside, drew her twin hunting knives, and sprinted toward the narrowest part of the gorge, dropping low to the ground. "Ambush West Ridge!" Alice roared, her voice tearing through the quiet of the camp. A split second later, a volley of black-fletched arrows rained down from the cliffs. They hit the canvas tents with heavy, wet thuds. Men shouted, horses screamed. Alice hit the snowy ground, sliding behind a massive boulder, just as an arrow shattered against the stone where her head had been a second before. The camp exploded into motion. Conrad's men were veterans. There was no panic. Rourke was already barking orders, forming a shield wall to protect the horses. But the mercenaries had the high ground. They were scaling down the sides of the gorge on ropes, heavily armored, carrying short swords and crossbows. Alice scanned the cliff face. Her eyes adapted to the dark, tracked the movements. There was a bottleneck, a narrow shelf of rock, where the mercenaries were landing before dropping into the camp. If they established a foothold there, they could rain fire down on the vanguard indefinitely. Alice didn't think. Instinct honed by 6 years of keeping the Oakhaven borders clear took over. She sheathed her knives, grabbed a coiled rope off a dead mercenary at her feet, and bolted for the cliff face. She climbed like a spider. She didn't use the ropes the Southerners had dropped. She used the natural fissures in the black slate, her fingers finding purchase in the freezing rock. Her stitched collarbone tore open. She felt the hot rush of blood down her chest, but the adrenaline drowned out the pain. She hauled herself up onto the rocky shelf just as 3 mercenaries touched down. They were large men wrapped in chainmail and thick furs. They saw a lone woman bareheaded and lightly armored and made the last mistake of their lives. They laughed. Alice drew her blades. She didn't roar. She didn't posture. She simply became violence. She dropped beneath the first man's clumsy sword swing, driving her left blade up through the unprotected gap beneath his chin. Blood sprayed hot across her face. Before his body hit the ground, she pivoted, using his falling weight to launch herself at the second man. She kicked his kneecap with a sickening crunch, sending him tumbling off the ledge into the darkness below. The third man hesitated. It was a fatal delay. Alice crossed the distance in a heartbeat, her right knife sinking deep into his armpit, severing the artery. She stood alone on the shelf, her chest heaving, her knives dripping black in the moonlight. She looked down at the camp. The fighting below was fierce, but the tide was turning. Conrad was in the center of the chaos. He didn't use a sword. He moved with a brutal, terrifying grace, crushing armor and bone with bare hands and a heavy iron mace. He was a force of nature, a god of war bathed in blood and shadow. He dispatched a mercenary, tossing the broken body aside, and looked up. Through the chaos, through the smoke and the falling snow, his silver eyes locked onto Alice. She stood on the high ground, covered in the blood of the men she had just killed to protect his camp. She held her ground, her knives raised, securing the flank entirely on her own. For the first time since she had met him, the Alpha King smiled. It was a terrifying, feral expression that sent a jolt of pure heat straight to the base of Alice's spine. The skirmish ended minutes later. The surviving mercenaries fled, vanishing back into the trees. They left behind 20 dead. Conrad's men had sustained injuries, but no fatalities. Alice climbed back down the rock face. Her arms were shaking from the exertion, her chest burning where the stitches had popped. She walked into the center of the camp, wiping the blood from her face with the back of her sleeve. Rourke approached her. The heavily tattooed man looked at the blood soaking her tunic, then looked up at the ledge where the 3 bodies lay. He didn't say a word. He simply raised his right fist and struck it hard against his heart, the northern salute. Respect. Absolute and unvarnished. Conrad stepped through the lines of men. He stopped in front of Alice. He looked at the fresh blood pooling on her chest. He reached out. Alice tensed, expecting a reprimand for breaking formation. Instead, Conrad's large, calloused hand gently cupped the back of her neck. His thumb brushed over her racing pulse. "You tore your stitches!" He rumbled softly, the battle rage still radiating off him in waves of heat. They had the high ground. Alice breathed out, looking up into his silver eyes. "I know," Conrad said. He didn't look away. "You took it from them." He dropped his hand and turned to Rourke. "Pack the camp. We move. They know where we are, and I want to be across the Deadlands by nightfall." As the camp broke down around them, Alice watched the king walk away. For the first time since Gareth had ripped the sigil from her chest, Alice didn't feel like a discarded ghost. She felt like a weapon that had finally found the right hand to wield it. They crossed the Deadlands in a grueling 4-day march. It was a barren expanse of cracked, frozen mud and petrified trees where the wind screamed uninterrupted from the glaciers. Alice didn't complain. The king's blood in her veins was a slow-burning furnace, keeping her core warm, even as frost rimed her eyelashes and turned the horse's breath to ice. She rode beside Rourke now. Conrad had moved her to the front of the column, explicitly placing her in the vanguard's command structure. It wasn't an act of charity. He asked her questions about the terrain, the snowpack, the migratory patterns of the southern herds. He didn't ask for her opinions on court politics. He asked how to kill men in the snow. She gave him precise, brutal answers. On the 5th day, Ethelgard rose from the mist. It wasn't a castle. It was a fortress carved directly into the sheer face of a black mountain. Massive iron gates stood 50 feet high, flanked by watchtowers that disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. It smelled of sulphur forge fires and thousands of wolves. As they rode through the gates, the courtyard erupted. But unlike the simpering, gossiping crowds of Oakhaven, this was the roar of an army greeting its general. Armor clattered. Weapons were raised in salute. Conrad dismounted his boots, hitting the stone with a heavy thud. He tossed his reins to a stable hand and turned to Alice. "Rourke will show you to the officers' quarters," Conrad said, his silver eyes sweeping over her exhausted frame. "Rest, eat. Tonight we hold a war council. You will be there." He didn't wait for her to agree. He turned and strode into the depths of the keep, swallowed by the shadows of the massive stone arches. Alice stared after him, a strange tightness in her chest. She had spent 6 years sleeping at the foot of Gareth's bed, treated as an extension of his will. Conrad had just handed her a seat at the high table of the realm. Her quarters were Spartan, a heavy iron bed, a wool mattress, a hearth, and a basin of hot water. She stripped off the blood-stiffened tunic, wincing as the cold air hit the jagged scar on her collarbone. She washed the grime and dried blood from her skin, the water turning a rusty brown. When she looked in the small, polished steel mirror above the basin, she hardly recognized herself. The girl who had desperately wanted a mate, who had wanted a pack to belong to, was dead on the floor of Oakhaven. The woman staring back at her had hollow cheeks, dark, bruised eyes, and the posture of a cornered wolf. She liked this woman better. She was harder to kill. A knock echoed against the heavy oak door. "Enter!" Alice called out, pulling a clean linen tunic over her head. The door opened, and Conrad stepped inside. He had shed his armor. He wore a simple black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose forearms, thick with muscle and corded scars. In one hand he carried a small clay jar. He didn't speak. He crossed the room, pulled up a wooden stool, and gestured for her to sit on the edge of the bed. Alice hesitated. The sheer proximity of him in the small room was overwhelming. His scent, wood smoke, and iron flooded her senses, making her wolf pace restlessly. But she sat. Conrad uncorked the jar. It smelled of pine resin and crushed mint. "Your stitches are holding, but the skin is inflamed." He said, his voice a low rumble. "This will draw out the infection. I can do it myself." Alice said, her voice tighter than she intended. Conrad's eyes flicked up to hers. "I know you can. That doesn't mean you have to." He reached out. Alice involuntarily held her breath. His fingers were rough, heavily calloused, from years of wielding a blade, but his touch was agonizingly gentle. He scooped a small amount of the salve and pressed it to the jagged tear across her collarbone. A hiss escaped her teeth as the salve burned, then immediately cooled. Conrad didn't pull away. He worked the ointment into her skin, his thumb tracing the line where Gareth had ripped her rank away. His jaw tightened a muscle feathering beneath his scarred cheek. "He took your sigil," Conrad said quietly, his gaze focused on the wound. "It was just bronze." Alice lied. Conrad paused. He looked up, his silver eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in them made her chest ache. "It wasn't just bronze. It was your proof that you existed, that you mattered. He tried to erase you." Alice swallowed hard. The lump in her throat was suddenly jagged and painful. "He succeeded. I have no pack. I have no rank. I am a ghost in another king's house." Conrad's hand slid from her collarbone to the back of her neck, his large fingers tangling in the short, dark hair at the nape. He stepped closer, stepping between her knees, forcing her to look up at him. The heat radiating off his body was immense. "You are no ghost," Conrad growled, his voice vibrating in her chest. "I felt you the moment I crossed Oakhaven's borders. Your anger, your violence, your absolute refusal to break. You burned so brightly in that hall I couldn't see anything else." He leaned in his face, inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her lips. "Gareth didn't unmake you, Alice. He just set you loose, and I intend to see exactly what you do with your freedom." He didn't kiss her. He didn't push. He held her gaze for 3 agonizing heartbeats, letting the promise of his words sink into her bones. Then he stepped back, capping the jar. "The council meets in an hour," he said, his tone returning to the flat, commanding cadence of a king. "Wear the black leather rorke left on the chest. It's northern armor. It will fit." The heavy door clicked shut behind him, leaving Alice staring at the empty space, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. When she entered the war room, the atmosphere was suffocating. A massive map of the territories was spread across a stone table, illuminated by iron chandeliers. A dozen warlords stood around it. These were the alphas of the deep North men who ruled through brutality and isolation. They fell silent as Alice walked in. She wore the black leather armor. It was functional, heavily reinforced at the joints, devoid of any decorative markings. She moved silently, stepping to Rourke's side. Conrad stood at the head of the table. Report. An older alpha with a missing eye, Lord Helfer pointed a thick finger at the map. Lord Alden has crossed the White River. He has 3,000 mercenaries, and he's dragged Gareth of Oakhaven with him. Gareth brings 1,000 wolves. They are marching on the Cinder Pass. Murmurs rippled through the room. The Cinder Pass was the choke point. If Alden took it, he had a straight march to Ethelgard. We hold the pass. Helfer continued. We build a shield wall. Let them break themselves against it. They won't break, Alice said. The room went dead silent. A dozen sets of alpha eyes snapped toward her, heavy with outrage. A packless female interrupting a council of lords. Helfer sneered. And who is this stray, the king's new bedwarmer? Conrad didn't yell. He didn't even move. He simply looked at Helfer. The temperature in the room plummeted. The sheer crushing weight of the king's aura slammed into the space, dropping Helfer to his knees, gasping for air as if an invisible hand had crushed his windpipe. She is Alice of the Northern Ridge, Conrad said softly, lethally. She has killed more rogues than you have teeth, Helfer. If you disrespect her again, I will let her cut out your tongue. Stand up. Helfer scrambled to his feet, pale and shaking. Conrad looked at Alice. Explain. Alice stepped up to the table. She didn't let her hands shake. She looked at the map, tracing the topography with a practiced eye. Alden is a southern lord. He fights in formations, phalanxes, shield walls. If you meet him in the pass with a static defense, he will use his crossbowmen to pick you apart from a distance, then crush you with sheer numbers. And Gareth knows the northern weather. He will time the assault with the next blizzard. So what do you suggest, Huntress? Conrad asked, watching her intently. We don't meet them in the pass. Alice said, her voice cold and absolute. We let them through. Outrage erupted again, but Conrad raised a hand, silencing them instantly. Go on. The Cinder Pass opens into the Whispering Valley. Alice pointed to a depression on the map. It's a bowl, steep ridges on all sides. We let their vanguard through the pass. We make them think our defense is weak. Once their main body is in the valley, we take the high ridges, we use the avalanches, we bury their supply lines, then we attack the flanks in small, fast skirmish groups, bleed them out, starve them, break their morale. She looked up, meeting the eyes of the men in the room. Wolves don't fight in shield walls. We are predators. We hunt. Silence stretched. The warlords looked at the map, then at her. The strategy was brutal. It required immense discipline and a complete abandonment of traditional honorable warfare. It was a slaughterhouse tactic. Conrad's silver eyes locked onto hers. The corner of his mouth curved into a slow, dark smile. Rourke, Conrad ordered. Mobilize the vanguard. We ride for the Whispering Valley. The snow in the Whispering Valley was waist-deep. Alice lay flat on her stomach on the eastern ridge, cloaked entirely in a white wolf pelt. The cold was a physical entity gnawing at her bones, but she ignored it. Next to her, 100 of Conrad's best hunters lay in utter silence, breathing through their mouths to prevent their breath from pluming in the freezing air. Below them, the Southern Army marched. It was a massive, clanking beast of steel and misery. Alden's mercenaries were freezing. They weren't equipped for the deep north. Their formations were sloppy, the men trudging through the drifts with their heads down against the biting wind. And there, riding near the front, was Gareth. He wore thick furs over polished armor, but he looked small. He looked cold. Sibylla was nowhere to be seen, undoubtedly left behind in the safety of a southern keep. Gareth was playing the warlord, but Alice could see the tension in his shoulders, the nervous way his horse pranced in the deep snow. Alice's wolf snarled in the back of her mind. Traitor. Weak. She placed her hand on the horn strapped to her belt. She watched the enemy column inch further into the bowl of the valley. Across the valley on the western ridge she caught the faint flash of steel. Conrad was in position. They waited. The tension was a vibrating wire pulling tighter and tighter with every crunch of the enemy's boots. Alice calculated the distance. She watched the heavy snowpack hanging precariously on the cliffs above the pass behind them. Just a little further, she prayed to the cold gods. Walk into the trap. The rear guard of Alden's army cleared the choke point. They were fully committed to the valley. Alice brought the horn to her lips and blew. The sound shattered the silence of the valley, a long, shrieking wail that echoed off the mountains like the cry of a dying god. Instantly, the western ridge erupted. Conrad didn't signal a charge. He signaled the earth. His heavy infantry, armed with massive mauls, struck the pre-weakened fault lines on the cliffs above the pass. The sound started as a low rumble felt in the teeth before it reached the ears. Then the mountain gave way. Thousands of tons of snow ice and black rock cascaded down the cliff face, entirely burying the cinder pass. The Southern army stopped. Panic rippled through their ranks. Their retreat was gone. They were trapped in the bowl. Now! Alice hissed. She stood up, drawing her twin hunting knives. With me, cut the flanks. She didn't run down the ridge. She bounded her movements fluid and utterly lethal. The 100 hunters behind her followed a silent white wave of death, descending on the chaotic southern lines. They hit the mercenaries before they could even form a shield wall. It was a slaughter. Alice moved like a wraith through the snow. She didn't engage in protracted sword fights. She slashed hamstrings, opened throats, and used the deep snow to trip heavily armored men, leaving them to drown in the powder while she moved to the next target. The air filled with the stench of copper and voided bowels. Across the valley, Conrad's forces tore into the enemy's front lines. The king was a terror on the battlefield. He had shifted. Not fully, he was still on 2 legs, but his muscles had expanded, his jaws elongated, his eyes glowing a blinding silver. He tore through Alden's elite guards as if they were made of parchment. Alice fought her way toward the center. She had one target. She found him shouting panicked orders to men who could no longer hear him over the screams. Gareth's horse had been killed. He was on foot, his polished sword dripping with blood, his face pale with terror. Gareth! Her voice cut through the din of the battle. It wasn't a shout, it was a promise. Gareth whipped around. When he saw her, the color drained from his face entirely. She was covered in gore, her eyes wide and wild, her twin knives gripped tightly in her hands. She looked like the vengeance of the North incarnate. Alice! He stammered, raising his sword. You traitor! You taught me how to sever a bond, Gareth. Alice said, stepping over the body of a dead mercenary. She didn't rush him. She walked toward him with a slow, predatory grace. Now I'm going to teach you how it feels. Gareth panicked. He dropped his sword and tried to use his alpha command. His eyes flashed gold, and he pushed the heavy, suffocating weight of his dominance toward her. Submit, kneel. A month ago it would have dropped her to the floor. It would have paralyzed her. Now it felt like a warm breeze. Alice laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound. She tapped her chest right above her heart. Your blood isn't in my veins anymore, little boy. Only a king's. She lunged. Gareth barely had time to raise his arm. Alice battered his guard aside with her left knife and drove her right boot into his knee. The joint gave way with a wet crack. Gareth screamed, dropping to the snow. Alice grabbed him by the front of his expensive furs. She hauled him upward, slamming her forehead into the bridge of his nose. Cartilage shattered. Blood sprayed across the white snow. He fell back, groaning, entirely broken. Alice stood over him. The battle raged on around them, but in this small circle of stained snow, there was only the two of them. She looked down at the man she had loved for 6 years, the man she had starved for, the man who had stripped her naked and bleeding in front of her pack. She raised her blade. She could end it. One thrust to the throat and the world would be rid of him. Her wolf screamed for the kill, but as she looked at him weeping and pathetic in the snow, the rage suddenly evaporated. It wasn't replaced by forgiveness. It was replaced by absolute, freezing indifference. killing him would be an intimate act. It would mean he still mattered. He didn't. She lowered her knife. "You aren't worth the edge of my steel." Alice spat. She reached down and grabbed the heavy gold chain around his neck, the alpha sigil of Oakhaven. With a vicious yank, she tore it from his throat. The links snapped, cutting into his skin. Gareth gasped, clutching his bleeding neck. "No, please. You are stripped of your rank." Alice said, her voice echoing perfectly the tone he had used in the Great Hall. "You are an Omega. You will crawl back to Alden, and you will live knowing a packless woman broke your army." She turned her back on him, and walked away, letting him bleed in the snow. By nightfall, the Whispering Valley was quiet. Lord Alden had surrendered after Conrad crushed his vanguard. The southern mercenaries who survived were disarmed and sent marching back toward the White River. Gareth was gone, dragged away by Alden's retreating men, a broken, packless coward. Alice stood on the eastern ridge looking down at the fires of the king's camp. The snow was falling again, gently covering the blood and the bodies washing the valley clean. She felt him before she heard him. The shift in the air. The heavy scent of pine and iron. Conrad stepped up beside her. He was covered in soot and dried blood. His armor dented his dire-bear mantle, wrapped heavily around his shoulders. He didn't speak immediately. He stood shoulder to shoulder with her, looking out over the valley they had just conquered together. "He's alive," Conrad said quietly. "He is," Alice replied. "I took his sigil. He is nothing now." "You showed mercy." "I showed contempt," Alice corrected, looking up at him. "Mercy is for people you respect." Conrad let out a low, rumbling chuckle. It was a warm sound, utterly at odds with the brutality of the day. He turned to face her. The battle haze had faded from his silver eyes, leaving them clear and piercing. He reached out his large hands, resting on her shoulders. He pulled her slightly closer. "Oakhaven is without an alpha," Conrad said. "I need a governor for the eastern ridges, someone who knows the terrain, someone who won't break." Alice's heart hammered against her ribs. "You want me to go back to rule them?" "No," Conrad said firmly. "I want you to burn it down. I want you to restructure it. I want you to command the east, but not from Oakhaven." His hand slid down her arms, his thumbs brushing against her wrists. He took a half-step closer, invading her space completely. The heat of him seeped through her armor, chasing away the bone-deep chill of the valley. "I don't collect prizes, Alice," Conrad murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that sent a shiver straight down her spine. "And I don't need a Luna to kiss babies. I need a queen who knows how to hold a knife." Alice stared at him, the breath catching in her throat. She had spent her life fighting for scraps of validation, fighting to be seen, fighting to be enough for a boy who only wanted a political pawn. Conrad didn't want a pawn. He wanted a partner in the slaughter. He wanted her exactly as she was, blood-stained, cynical, and lethal. "I don't know how to be a queen," Alice whispered, the vulnerability finally cracking through her armored shell. Conrad reached up his hand, cupping the side of her face. His thumb traced the sharp line of her cheekbone, wiping away a smear of soot. "You already are," he said. He didn't ask for permission this time. He leaned down and captured her lips with his. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was possessive bruising and tasted of iron and snow. It was an absolute claim, not of ownership, but of recognition. Alice gasped, her hands coming up to grip the front of his heavy tunic. The empty, hollow space in her chest, the void where her old pack bond used to be suddenly ignited. It wasn't the quiet, steady hum of the Oakhaven bond. This was a roaring fire, a tether of pure, unadulterated power tying her directly to the soul of the Alpha King. Her wolf howled in her mind, a sound of absolute triumph, bowing to the king and rising as his equal. Alice kissed him back, pouring all her anger, her grief, and her fierce, unbroken will into it. She bit his lower lip, drawing a drop of blood, and Conrad growled, pulling her flush against his massive chest. When they finally broke apart, Alice was breathless, her forehead resting against the hard angle of his jaw. The cold wind howled around them, but she didn't feel it. The South will retaliate. Alice murmured, her eyes closed, listening to the steady, booming rhythm of his heart. Let them. Conrad rumbled, his arms tightening around her. They will find the North is no longer divided. Alice opened her eyes, looking out over the dark expanse of the Deadlands. She was no longer a discarded huntress. She was the queen of the Iron North, and she was going to make the world bleed. If you loved seeing Alice forge her own bloody path and claim the king who saw her true worth, do not leave without hitting that like button. This story proves that the best revenge isn't just surviving, it's conquering. Share this video with your pack of romance lovers who crave fierce heroines and unapologetic alpha kings. We drop dark, gripping stories like this every week, so make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a chapter. Let us know in the comments. What was your favorite moment of Alice's revenge? See you in the next tale.